So you were first asked to reflect this or rotate this triangle around the midpoint of side BC and create this figure here, and then to explain why sides AC and A prime C prime would be parallel. And so what we know is that the two angles that, so we know we have the two lines, AC and A prime C prime. And we also know we have this transversal that cuts both lines, forming two alternate interior angles here. And therefore we know that because these two angles have to be congruent, because one was created just by rotating the other triangle, and these are corresponding angles, that because these two interior alternate angles are congruent, that means that AC and A prime C prime have to be parallel to each other. Okay, so then the second thing that you were asked to do was you were asked to explain why we would get when we look at the diagonal here, the second diagonal, and we create point D here, why we know that AD and A prime D prime are congruent and that BD and CD are congruent, or in other words, that these two diagonals bisect each other. So what we're saying is that these two are congruent and these two are congruent. And so what we need to do in order to prove that is to show that this triangle is congruent to this triangle, but that A and A prime are corresponding so that it's flipped over. And that's why we would have A prime D would be the side that corresponds to AD. Okay, so let's take a look at what we know about this. So we know, for example, that we have some congruent angles here and here because of the transversal. We also know that we have some congruent angles here and here because we also know that this is another transversal, and it is because we know these sides are parallel, we know that these two angles here, we'll do double marks, are also congruent. And we also know that side AC and side A prime C prime are congruent because they were created just by rotating this triangle, and so those are corresponding sides. So what we have then is we have angle, side, angle, angle, side, angle congruence of these two triangles, and that means that BD and CD are congruent because they're corresponding sides, and we know that DA and DA prime are also corresponding sides of congruent triangles, so they are also congruent. And that means that these two diagonals will always bisect each other. Okay, so then we were asked in the last thing to show that when we, instead of rotating this thing, sorry, one second here. We reflect it, and so that we get something that looks like this. And now what we're saying is that when we draw the second diagonal, we want to show that these two are going to be, the two diagonals are going to be perpendicular to each other. And the way that we can show that is by saying, well, we have that AB and A prime B prime are congruent because one is just a reflection of the other. We know that the angle here, CBA, is congruent to the angle at CBA prime 1, and thus, again, because there's a reflection there, we also know that this side is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. That means that these two angles here, and I'm going to do a right angle symbol for a reason I'll explain in a minute. We know that these two angles here have to be congruent by CP, CTC. But we also know that these two angles are supplements, and that means that they sum to 180, which means that each of them has to have a measure of 90 degrees, which means that these two diagonals form a 90-degree angle, which means that they are perpendicular to each other.